In 1933, New York City suffered a brutal attack. Records tell of a giant primate terrorizing downtown Manhattan. The beast climbed the Empire State Building and apparently wrought havoc with local air traffic control. The event didn't end well for the belligerent, if somewhat misunderstood gorilla, who came to a rather sticky end on the sidewalks of the busy city. No fatalities from falling primate were reported though. The specimen was originally captured at great cost by a swashbuckling adventurer from a distant tropical location, Skull Island. The expedition arrived by boat and was almost immediately attacked by fierce cannibals who inhabited that lonely outcrop of land in the Pacific Ocean. This was a land where time stood still, a land of steaming jungles full of tall, prehistoric plants reaching for the skies with giant pterosaurs flying overhead, a land full of ancient giants like lumbering Brontosaurus and terrifying Tyrannosaurus rex, both of who would provide a considerable nuisance to the expedition's attempt to collect a certain primate specimen. Of course, what I'm describing here is the classic black and white movie King Kong by Merian C. Cooper. Cooper, though, based his 1933 classic on a real expedition in 1926 by the explorer W. Douglas Burden. The island he would travel to was not Skull Island, but Komodo Island, just west of the island of Flores in Indonesia. It is likely that much of the imagery in the movie was taken from the accounts of Burden's expedition. There are no gorillas on Komodo, but there is a pretty good dinosaur substitute, the world's largest predatory lizard, the Komodo dragon. It's been suggested that Cooper so liked the K sound in Komodo dragon that in naming his monster gorilla, he used the same K to give us King Kong. Burden returned from his 1926 expedition with 12 specimens, 2 of them live and 3 of them stuffed and displayed in another venerable museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Today, the Komodo dragon, which is an endangered species, is being held from the brink of extinction in part by the efforts of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1992, the Smithsonian National Zoological Park was one of the first zoos outside of Indonesia to hatch clutches of dragons with various hatchlings distributed to zoos around the world. So in this episode, let's ask, who is the Komodo dragon? Where are the dragons from? What world did the dragons leave behind? And what does the future hold for the Komodo dragon? Let me paint a picture of this fascinating creature for you. There are various names for the dragons. On the Indonesian islands around Komodo, they are called the Ora Buaya Darat, the land crocodile, or the Biawak Rakasa, meaning giant monitor. Scientifically, we give them the generic name Varanus, from the Arabic word waril, meaning dragon or lizard beast. This is the name given to all monitor lizards, including the Komodo dragon. The species name, Komodoensis, is taken from the island where they are most famously found, giving us monitor lizard from Komodo, or Varanus komodoensis. I'm going to stick with Burden's name, as I think it paints a better picture of this wonderful animal, the Komodo dragon. The dragons were unknown to Europeans until about 1910, when reports of a land crocodile reached the Dutch administrators of what was then the Dutch East Indies. One Lieutenant van Stein Hensbroek was the first European to capture and kill a specimen that sparked a great interest in these ancient beasts. Just 17 years later, 2 live specimens were proudly exhibited when the London Zoo Reptile House opened in 1927. I was lucky enough to visit beautiful Komodo Island in February of 2015. We arrived early in the morning and I can still remember the thrill of peering out of my porthole on this beautiful island. It really did fit the bill of an exotic skull island. Although the population has expanded in recent years, it still appeared deserted and somehow primitive from the ocean. February is the rainy season in this part of the world, so these deeply dissected volcanic rocks were painted a fantastic lush green colour. In front of those green cliffs there was a thin strip of yellow sand, but from the boat no T-Rex, Brontosaurus or Komodo dragons could be seen. At least, not yet. As the island is part of the Komodo National Park, you can only visit with official park guides who escorted us through this beautiful landscape of Komodo. The usually dry island is a mix of open grass, woodland savanna and tropical deciduous forests. This was the first evidence we found of the dragons. Poop. It looks pretty much like a large bird dropping, a very large bird dropping. The white material, as with birds, is the urate, that's the pee, and the dark material is the stool, which as reptiles they all pass through the same orifice, the cloaca. The forest we were moving through was pretty quiet. I saw occasional birds, but there was very little noise apart from the whispers of the others in our party. I was also keeping a wary eye out for snakes, as there were a number of poisonous species on the island, but the snakes were probably more scared of me than I was of them, especially with us crashing through the landscape, even though we did think we were being terribly quiet and stealthy. After a bit of a hike across some hilly terrain, we were led to an area where a waterhole had been dug to attract the dragons, and after a few minutes to allow our eye to adjust to the dim light under the trees, there they were. Komodo dragons. The dragons were mostly sleeping but still looked formidable. You can see me in this picture looking thrilled but slightly nervous, as the only protection we had from these big animals were guides with, well, big fork sticks. These are big animals. An average male is around 2.5 meters long and about 91 kilograms. The largest recorded specimen was about 3.13 meters long and weighed 166 kilograms, that's 365 pounds, although this may have included some undigested food from a recent meal. It is estimated they have a lifespan of around about 30 years. They have a long, muscular tail, as long as the body, and a long, flat, crocodile-like head with a rounded snout. Very much on my mind during this encounter were those powerful front limbs and curved claws which are formidable weapons, and who could not be mesmerised by that long, forked yellow tongue that flicks in and out of the dragon's mouth. They're built a bit like a tank, with skin that is armoured with osteoderm bone knobbles forming a kind of chainmail pattern. Despite their position as top predator of these islands, they will quite happily eat carrion. Islanders will often place piles of rocks on graves, not to mark the position of a loved one, but as a very practical solution to stop Komodo dragons from digging up Granny's grave for a quick snack. No one wants to look up from dinner to see a beloved relative being taken for a post-mortem drag by a large lizard. The dragons will hunt, well, almost anything. Invertebrates, eggs, lizards, and mammals including monkeys, goats, water buffalo and other items. Some of their favoured prey is the Timor rusa deer, but Komodo dragons are not fussy eaters and will on occasion eat other Komodo dragons. Attacks on humans have also been reported. They're not designed to run down prey like wolves do. In common with other reptiles of this genus, they have legs that stick out to the side, giving them a characteristic gait, with their bodies swaying from side to side, as you can see in this specimen that rather unexpectedly decided to cross the path we were on. The Komodo dragon is an ambush predator, using short bursts of speed, around 20 kilometers per hour, to quickly lunge at a creature and strike. Small prey tend to get bit in the middle of the neck, sometimes even being knocked over by a swipe from that powerful tail. For larger prey, they adopt a bite and retreat strategy, critically wounding a larger creature, perhaps like a water buffalo, and then waiting for it to die. A large creature like this can be very dangerous when wounded, so it's a much safer option to just let nature and shock take its course. But is there more to the dragon's bite? A common hypothesis is that the Komodo dragon will kill their prey with the aid of virulent strains of bacteria found in their mouths, often described as being full of rotting flesh. It is presumed that the bite from the Komodo dragon infects its prey with so much bacteria, including Escherichia coli and strains of Staphylococcus, that they go into septic shock and die as a result. This could be termed the sepsis hypothesis. Recently, though, research published in 2013 by a number of scientists, including Dr. Ellie Goldstein of the R.M. Alden Research Laboratory in California, have questioned this model. They suggest that the bacterial flora of the Komodo dragon is really no different from other large predators. One of the researchers in the team, Professor Brian Fry of the University of Queensland in Australia, has suggested why this sepsis hypothesis may have come about in the first place. It centres around water buffalo, a creature only recently introduced to the island, which as adults are really too large to be seriously bothered by the Komodo dragon. When bitten by the Komodo dragon, the buffalo generally have no trouble escaping, but their first instinct is to escape to a wallow hole. These wallow holes are full of feces and bacteria, and it is probably here that the wounds of the buffalo get infected and develop sepsis. This means they die not as a result of bacterial infection from the Komodo dragon's mouth, but as a result of their own pre-programmed behaviour. Of course, the Komodo dragon has no issue with eating a buffalo that has died from an infection in a dirty wallow hole, though. Waste not, want not. Again, though, could there be something else to the dragon's bite? In a paper published in 2009, Fry and a number of other researchers used magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, to analyse the skull of a Komodo dragon and model its bite. What they found was that the dragon does not have a particularly powerful bite when compared to that of a crocodile, for example. In addition, the Komodo dragon does not have a strong skull or jaw muscles to subdue their prey. So, if not dirty mouths and powerful jaws, just how does the Komodo dragon kill its prey? First, they have strong muscles behind their skull to resist the prey as it attempts to pull away from the dragon. This action involves the slicing and ripping of flesh, aided by very long 2.5 centimetre serrated teeth. But there is something else. A venom gland that delivers venom through cavities between the teeth, getting quickly into the bloodstream of the prey. Fry's research showed that Komodo dragon venom prevented blood clotting, lowered blood pressure, and caused the prey to go rapidly into shock. But what else does the Komodo dragon have in its hunting armoury? Well, they can see objects about 300 metres away, but have difficulty distinguishing between non-moving objects. They also have a rather poor night or dim light vision, so their eyes are okay, but certainly not eagle-like. Their hearing isn't too great either. They have a reduced range when compared to humans. They would have difficulty in detecting low and high-pitched sounds, so I guess that rules out Barry White and the Bee Gees on a Komodo dragon's iPod. But what they do have is a very keen sense of smell, a sense of smell that can detect carrion 2.5 miles away. Most of the smell, though, is not detected through the nostrils. Instead, they use that wonderful yellow tongue that continually tastes the air. The Komodo dragon assists this detection by swinging its head from side to side as it walks. Like snakes, these scents are passed to a feature called the Jacobson's organ. This organ can tell if more scent molecules are present on the right or the left fork of the tongue, and in this way, the dragon can zero in on dinner. As you might guess, the eating habits of the Komodo dragon are less than elegant, ripping off chunks of flesh or swallowing smaller prey whole. They are very efficient in devouring most of their kill, with adults only needing 12 large meals a year. Carrion or a kill will often attract numbers of other dragons, creating feeding frenzies that have been observed to have some sort of order, with the older and larger Komodo dragons getting first dibs at the table. As with their eating habits, Komodo dragons cannot be said to be sensitive lovers. Mating occurs between May and August, competing males wrestling, sometimes by getting up onto their hind legs and using their tails for support, with the loser being thrown to the ground. Females are said to be somewhat antagonistic to mating and may have to be physically held in place by the male. However, male Komodo dragons can coax as well by flicking their tongues over the female's body. I guess it's a Komodo dragon thing. The female delays laying eggs until September to avoid the heat of the dry season. A clutch of around 20 to 30 eggs is laid in September and take between 7 to 8 months to incubate. Komodo dragons will often use the nests of megapode birds like the orange-footed scrub fowl to lay their eggs. Megapode nests are quite remarkable feats of engineering at around 1 metre high and 3 metres wide. They consist of a ditch filled with rotting compost that slowly gives off heat into which the bird's eggs are laid. The ditch is then covered by a layer of insulating sand, a structure which the female Komodo dragons are more than happy to burrow into and co-opt for their own needs. The female sits on the nest protecting her investment, but as soon as the eggs hatch, she abandons her young, who are immediately in a precarious state. They only weigh about 100 grams and are about 40 centimetres long and a potential dinner item for other animals, including Komodo dragons, who are estimated to eat around 10% of their hatchlings. As a result, the hatchlings tend to live up in trees, eating insects, small lizards and similar fare until they get a little bit larger. So, why in a series about paleontology am I talking so much about a living species? Well, it appears that the presence of the Komodo dragons on a small number of Indonesian islands is part of an older paleontological story that has only relatively recently come to light. Komodo dragons today are found on the islands of Gili Montang, Gili Desami, Rinca, Komodo and Flores. This is a pretty isolated distribution and leads to an important question. How do you get a 200-pound lizard to a group of small Indonesian islands? One possibility is something called the island effect. A common feature on islands is the way that creatures will either get larger or smaller in response to the conditions that they find themselves in. For example, consider Stegodon, a type of prehistoric elephant with a long geological range from 11.6 million years to relatively recently in the late Pleistocene. Stegodons were large creatures with some as tall as 3.8 metres. Like modern elephants, Stegodons were probably good swimmers and may have reached the Indonesian islands like Flores and others when sea levels were low. On the islands though, the Stegodons would start to shrink, probably as an adaptation to the more limited resources on the island, perhaps becoming about the size of a water buffalo. The reverse can occur too. For example, the giant rat Carnariomyas bravoi from the island of Tenerife off the coast of northwest Africa clocks in at about 1 kilogram in weight and is 114 centimetres long. This rat may have got large perhaps due to a reduced number of large predators, but also a larger body and stomach can more efficiently digest poor quality food that you might have to deal with on a small island. So did Komodo dragon arrive as a small lizard and grow large as part of the island effect? Or is it possible, as been suggested by some, that the Komodo dragon grew large as a result of a need to prey on the dwarf but still large stegodon elephants in the same environment? According to these hypotheses, small monitor lizards get washed onto the islands, perhaps on mats of vegetation or alternatively by floods or even tsunamis, and then evolve into the large Komodo dragon that we know of today. But there is an alternate hypothesis. Perhaps there has been no change in the size of the Komodo dragon at all. Perhaps they arrived on the islands at their present size, in which case we had the same question. How do you get a 200-pound lizard to a group of small islands? But another one too. If they did come from elsewhere, just where did they come from? To answer the question of how, you have to understand that we are currently in a relatively warm interval during the current ice age, the last glacial advance of which ended about 12,000 years ago. During the various glacial maxima, sea levels would fall, linking many of the current islands in Indonesia, or at least reducing the amount of ocean between them. At these times, the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Java and Sumatra were part of a landmass called Sunda, while Australia and New Guinea were part of a landmass called Sahul. The increased landmass and reduced distance between these islands facilitated the migration of certain species into this area. Oceanic channels, such as exist between Bali and Lombok, were still present, which could prevent complete mixing of these island biotas, even during times of very low sea level. When the ice melted and sea levels rose again, the species that had migrated to these islands were trapped. This led to an isolated evolution of their flora and fauna and explains why this is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. In a biogeographical sense, this area is called Wallacea in honour of Alfred Wallace, a co-author with Darwin on the first paper describing evolution by natural selection. Wallace spent many years describing the unique distribution of species in this part of the world, an often forgotten and yet very important figure in science. But what about the second question? The where did they come from? From the north or the south? Recent paleontological evidence suggests that these wonderful beasts are Australians. Komodo dragons are part of an ancient megafauna, and as such, you could think of them as living fossils. Most of us are pretty familiar with the Northern Hemisphere megafauna, giant mammoths and mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses and fearsome saber-toothed cats like I have behind me here. But most of this fauna was extinct by about 11,700 years ago. But other megafauna developed on island Australia. By 50 million years ago, Australia had separated from other landmasses in the Southern Hemisphere, but was still close enough to allow migration of creatures from South America across an ice-free Antarctica and into a northward drifting Australia. As time progressed and as the ocean widened, Australia became isolated and all those creatures were marooned. And evolution in isolation can do some pretty amazing things. The original wave of migration from South America included mammals, but not the placental mammals we are most familiar with in the Northern Hemisphere, principally marsupials, mammals that carry their young in a pouch. From what were probably small migrants from South America, a whole array of spectacular animals would evolve, including this marsupial line, a top marsupial predator, some of which could be as large as 164 kilograms. Cave paintings from the Kimberley area in northwestern Australia suggest that some of the ancient Aboriginal peoples of Australia came face to face with this terrifying creature. There was also relatives of a familiar Australian icon, the koala, but not the cute, cuddly koala we all know and love today, a giant koala, Diprotodon, the size of a bear. It has been speculated that Diprotodon may have been the beast behind the Aboriginal legends of the bunyip, a creature or water spirit said to live in billabongs and creeks and other sources of open water that would prey on unsuspecting people that got too close. But it's not all marsupials. This is Dromornis, a large flightless bird around 10 feet tall that inhabited open woodlands and is thought by some to have been carnivorous. There are also giant snakes like the Bluff Downs giant python from the early Pliocene of Queensland. A close relative of this snake is the olive python, but its fossil cousin is estimated to have been around 10 metres, that's 33 feet long. But there were other reptilian components of this megafauna, and lurking around in the Australian bush was a monitor lizard, even larger than the Komodo dragon. This is Megalania, or Varanus priscus to give it its scientific name. As no complete skeleton has been found, estimates of the size of this monster vary from 5.5 metres to about 7 metres. Even on the small end of the scale, this is still significantly larger than the Komodo dragon. Analysis of the fossils of this beast by a team, including venom expert Brian Fry at the University of Queensland, has suggested that, like the Komodo dragon, this lizard was also venomous. This would have made it quite the formidable predator in Australia and one of the largest venomous creatures to have existed. Megalania fossils are known from Pleistocene deposits of eastern Australia, aged between 2.6 million and 30,000 years ago, which opens up the possibility that the first humans to range across Australia may have also encountered this animal too. Additional research in 2009 from the University of Queensland by Scott Hucknall and colleagues would also put to rest the origin of the Komodo dragon in Indonesia, as fossil evidence shows that the Komodo dragon coexisted with Megalania. Their studies show that Komodo dragons had dispersed as far as the island of Flores by 900,000 years ago and to Java between 800,000 to 700,000 years ago. The Komodo dragon of today, therefore, represents a relic population of a lineage of giant monitor lizards that was once common in eastern Australia and Wallacea as far as Java. By 2,000 years ago, the last remaining members of this group of monster lizards had retracted to Flores and the small surrounding islands like Komodo. In fact, much of the Australian megafauna, with notable exceptions like the red kangaroo, were extinct by about 30,000 years before present, probably due to a combination of factors including climate change and interaction with humans. So what is the status of the last surviving relic of these giant lizards? It's estimated that the population hovers around 3,000 individuals in the wild, placing them in a very vulnerable status. The decline in population is due to a number of factors. The Lesser Sunda Islands are highly volcanically active, and as such, natural disasters can easily tip a delicate island ecosystem into crisis. Human interaction, though, has also had a serious effect. The dragons have been suffering from loss of habitat and poaching of their prey. They have also been deliberately poisoned, and some dragons have been captured, presumably for personal collections or trophies. In 1980, the Komodo National Park was set up to include the islands of Komodo, Rinca, Padar, as well as reserves and Flores. In total, it covers an area of about 1,733 square kilometres. In 1991, this area was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I do hope we're not seeing the last days of the Komodo dragon. I hope that the efforts of those involved in protecting the dragons in the wild and breeding programs in various locations around the world will help preserve this remarkable creature. Let's hope they do not go the way of their even scarier Australian ancestors.